All right, our last topic for today, catching.
Catching at the youth level.
Yeah.
So here's the first thing I'll say. It becomes, I don't, outside of the pitcher, I think the catcher, especially at 13, 14, is such an integral position on the field. Like if you have a really, really good catcher, everybody's life gets so much easier versus if you are lacking on that in that position, especially at younger ages, but really, I mean, forever in baseball. But I don't know. It just seems especially apparent to me at 13, 14 that a really good defensive catcher can make a huge difference. And one of the biggest contributions, one of the biggest contributions is it just like helps pitchers so much. Like when you have a guy who not only can catch the ball well and can frame well, but can block well, where your 13, 14 pitchers aren't scared with, a guy on third and 2 outs to bounce their 0-2 changeup. Like they're not worried about that. And if you can take that kind of fear out of their brain, I think it just gets so much easier for guys on the bump.
Yeah, and and obviously I coach 14U, which I think is a big jump in what you would expect from kids. That's like kind of where they're transitioning out of youth baseball, because a lot of those kids are pretty grown. Like our 14 team is probably a little bit bigger than our 15U team. So that 14, 15 age group, what's expected of them is very different. So for me, like we have 3 catchers, and I was very clear from the beginning that when a ball hits the dirt, we're going to have a full block, or you're not going to catch, or you're not going to go out there and catch. And when you watch a lot of teams, there's a lot of players who block extremely well. We've been taught very well, and then there's lots of kids who don't know how to block, and they'll kind of go down. They'll go down to kind of like a half lunge, or they'll go down. Their glove is up, and all that stuff at this level is just not acceptable anymore, because you can't block. Like a lot of balls go to the dirt, obviously, and as kids start to throw breaking balls, more and more balls go to the dirt. So it really just becomes imperative, and it becomes like a fork in the road where you can either block or you can't, and it's not necessarily because you don't know how. It's because it hasn't just been like force fed that you absolutely have to block every ball that hits the dirt. Now, there's some times when even big league catchers pick the ball, doesn't make it right. And fastballs, admittedly, and you can speak more to this, are tougher to block, especially when kids throw hard, because that's the biggest thing. Like my team has some hard throwing 14-year-olds that are into the mid 70s, a couple in the upper 70s, and if they throw a fastball that's like barely going to hit the dirt, like maybe hit the dirt, maybe not, that's just a really tough ball. And even the big leagues, that's the one you see go to the screen on a fastball more than anything else. Big league catchers can leap up and catch a high fastball. They're super athletic. But when you see that fastball that is just going to hit the dirt right where the mitt goes, where it's going to hit like the bottom, like here's the ground, it's just going to boom right where their catcher's mitt goes, that's the one where you just barely slip under because it's not clear if they can catch it or if they have to block it. And but anyway, just that the decision making for me is it's clearly where speeds get higher, it's tough for catchers to mentally, as soon as it leaves the hand, their brain clicks. Oh, trajectory of this changeup means it's going to hit the dirt. I got to block. It's going to be over here. I got to slide. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of repetition, and it really just does, I think, take someone to enforce. Like, no, it's not okay for you to not have your mitt on the ground in a full block on every single one that hits the dirt. Because if you allow some of it, then it just continues to be sloppy over time. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it's analogous to hitters learning how to hit off-speed pitches, where you're looking for the same thing. That a fastball versus a curveball versus a changeup looks different out of the hand to a hitter, but your ability to recognize that takes time and it takes a lot of volume. You have to see a lot of those pitches to start to establish like what does that curveball look like out of a 14, 15-year-old's hand. Same thing goes with catching, that there is that trajectory that you see a ball leaving the hand where you're like, that ball is a problem. And part of it is just seeing more pitches, and you have to see a lot of pitches and block a lot of pitches to get good at it, which is just like a simple answer. But what I always tell my catchers is there's a big, big mental component to it, where if you're mentally prepared to block, which I'll kind of talk about in a second, blocking gets easier, right? So by being mentally prepared to block, I mean, when you're teaching a catcher, they're in first position, they're giving their sign, and then they hop up into second position. So when you're in second position, your feet are going to be a little bit wider, so you have a wider base. The weight is on the ball of your foot. Your butt goes up in the air a little bit. And what this is meant to do is make it easier for you to either get down to block or should someone be stealing a base, you can get into throwing position easier. And so the whole idea then, how we transition to block is we're going to take our cleats essentially and kick them out from behind us, whoop, so that our knees drop straight down and we're in a position to block. So that's why our butt kind of has to get up, because if you're sitting with your butt on your heels, you have to then transition to get up and then clear space for your feet to get out from underneath you. So it just takes too long, right? So you go, okay, great, I understand that. Now I have, maybe I'm a technically sound blocker in my dry drills or whatever, and then I'm trying to get that to then happen at game speed. Well, that requires that you can identify a pitch to then get down to block. What makes that way easier is when you can kind of play an odds game in your head, where you say to yourself, what are the chances this next pitch is going to be thrown in the dirt? For an 0-2 curveball, that's obviously really easy to do, because you're like, there's a really high chance this is going to require that I block. And so if you look at, if you have a decent catcher, they're going to block a really high percentage of that 0-2 curveball that bounces, right? It's the
so they're kind of ready to block and adjust to catch.
Exactly.
Rather than it seems like everyone else is ready to catch and they have to think to block.
Okay, so that's the point I want to make. Where if you look at, it's the 1-0 fastball that's in the dirt. That's the one that gets by guys, right? And so because you expect, what are the chances this guy throws his 1-0 fastball in the dirt? Like, it shouldn't be any, but of course it's going to happen. And so what I tell everybody is be in a mental state where you are mentally prepared to block, because one of two things is going to happen. Either there's going to be an actual pitch you have to block, but you're already mentally prepared to do it, so then you have no reservation about getting down to block, or it's going to be a pitch in the air, but you're already in a position to catch it, so you don't have to do anything. So even if it surprises you, air quotes, where you're like, oh, he's actually throwing this 1-0 fastball at my mitt, I don't have to do anything to adjust to it. Now, the other caveat I'll throw in here is anytime I'm talking to my catchers about that, that's a really effective strategy, but it's also mentally exhausting. Where if you imagine you have to catch 130 pitches in a game, to be doing that every single time on top of keeping track of what the count is, what pitch I should throw, who's on base, what's the score, what's the inning, all that kind of stuff, it's mentally exhausting to do that. But unfortunately, that's just kind of the gig as a catcher, is you have to, it's physically tiring. You're leaning on your quads and your hamstrings a lot and your hips. But it's also mentally fatiguing in that you're trying to play the little cat and mouse game of getting hitters out on top of being mentally prepared to wear a ball off the chest if you need to. But it's just the only way to do it. And especially when you're learning, if you just put in that philosophy and you did it pitch after pitch after pitch after pitch, you're going to get to a point where you've seen enough pitches that it starts to become second nature. MLB catchers probably aren't going through that thought process when they're receiving a pitch, because they've seen enough that they're just instinctually going to go boop. But when you're 13 and you haven't seen any of those pitches, that's the kind of mental approach you have to take.
Yeah, and I actually have a perspective of this just catching bullpens. I've caught a lot of bullpens, and usually without gear. When I catch harder throws, I'll put shin guards on, but I just catch a lot of, especially for the youth pitchers, 14 and below, rather than have a catcher come in they're throwing 70. It's not that 70 or less, not that big a deal. I'll just catch them. Plus, it just gives me because I like seeing the catcher perspective anyway. But I did this just yesterday. So I had a lesson yesterday with a kid that we worked with for a long time, Jace, and he rarely bounces his fastball, but when he throws his changeup, it has a good amount of sink to it, and he'll bounce it some of the time. So when I'm catching his fastball, I'll just sit back on my legs and just be prepared to catch it. But when he throws changeups, I usually kind of go into second position because I don't want to get hit in the nuts. So I kind of got to get ready to get out of the way. So for me, it's that same thing. I have a pretty good idea based on the pitcher. If I can be comfortable, with him throwing his fastball, I'm very comfortable that, 28 out of 30 are going to be in my mitt or above, which not that you want to be up in the zone, but he doesn't really bounce fastballs that often. Or if he does, they just they're pickable. Mm-hmm. They're not bouncing. The one that's going to hit me in the body is going to be the short, the in-between hop where it bounces 4 feet in front of the plate. Those are tough to pick. And obviously doesn't throw a breaking ball. But when I had to catch high school kids throwing, and high school kids are the worst because they throw hard enough to hurt you. Their breaking pitches are inconsistent, so they're in the dirt a lot. The spins is inconsistent, so they bounce different. A curveball with 1-7 spin will bounce backwards, but high school kids throw the worst curveballs in the world, so they bounce all different directions. They'll bounce 4 curveballs in a row, and then they'll bounce 4 changeups in a row. Then they'll throw a fastball nowhere in particular. It's those guys that have enough speed and enough stuff, but not that much command. It makes it pretty scary. I know you've express that sentiment. Catching like pro guys is way easier than catching a high school kid, even though you could be throwing 95. You have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen and just right to your mitt or right to the little quadrant that you're at. But with kids that are still learning to throw strikes and that maybe throw pretty hard, it just can be fastball, slider, changeup. It's just all over, and you're just nervous as a catcher trying to figure out what to do. So obviously being a good strike thrower helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, no, I get that. It's definitely wears you out, and like I'm in the mindset to get out of the way, which that's for me blocking. I'm gonna block it, but I'm gonna get out of the way, or I'm gonna, protect myself, or I'm in the mindset to just like receive it. I have a pretty good idea that I'm safe, and so I understand that. But yeah, no, it's tough. You just see that they haven't seen enough pitches, and when they get harder throwers, and there's just a lot to the pitching and catching positions. There's a lot going on for them to have enough mental bandwidth to process everything. Like, all right, the runner might be going. If it's down, I have to block it. If first and third
they might be
situations,
bunting.
like there's lots of stuff that goes on, and often if they forget, then the ball goes down, then it's too late, and then they try to catch it, or they kind of like half get down, they try to catch it, and even if they block it, like we had a lot of successful blocks this past weekend where they successfully blocked it, but their your 6 hole was not covered, like not good enough. Like I know you got an okay result, but that's got to get better because those are going to get by you over
and
time.
It never gets easier too, because like, okay, so let's say, because at 13, basically what I'm working on with catchers is, and I hesitate to use the word scared of the ball because they're not, but no one wants to get hit with a baseball.
It's not second nature to throw yourself in front of it.
Exactly. So that's kind of what you're working on 12, 13 is getting guys used to impact. And, I like to think that I was like this. I know some of the best catchers that I played with were just like unapologetically not scared of getting hit, where you look at really good catchers and they'll just like throw arms and shoulders and wrists in front of balls to knock them down. And you kind of have to teach yourself that. It's not like you said, it's not, no one has that nature, animal nature. So you're just like teaching impact and like how the technique behind how to minimize the pain of impact really. And so you kind of work on that. So then at 14 ish, now you're working on like more technique stuff, like you're talking about, like, okay, it's not good enough just to be in a position to block. We have to be in a good technical position that we're like the ball is ending up kind of where we want it to go, because then at maybe even good 14 or 15, you might have a great technical block, but then if the ball's not doing what you want it to do, or you're not positioned to get up, guys will run on you anyway, and it defeats the whole purpose. That if a ball squirts away from me because I'm too big in my chest, good runners are going to be reading that down angle, and as soon as they see it squirt away, they're off to the next base, and then it's just like you had a pass ball. So you're like working on that. There's always a jump in kind of the results you're trying to gain as a catcher as you move up through. So it never really gets easier, but it's just kind of like, pitching never gets any easier either. So it's just kind of, it's a tough position, and it takes a certain mindset. And there's a lot, what's fascinating to me is I feel like there's a lot of kids who like catching, but there aren't a lot of kids who I would say are cut out to be catchers, in that catching is fun because you are involved in every play. You have a high effect on the game. I don't know. It's just like a cool position. You get to wear cool stuff, but it's also, it takes a weird person to be a catcher too.
Well, and like catching bullpens and just watching, I feel like catching is, and I don't mean to say that it's easy because it's certainly not, as we've already discussed. I feel like catching is one of the most controllable positions where if you wanted to be great at catching, you could do it. I feel like if I went back, knowing what I know now, like obviously I love pitching, and I wouldn't, if I went back in time, I would not be a pitcher. But I feel like if I went back in time, knowing what I know now, I could start as like an 8th grader, and I could have, I think, maybe been like a big league catcher. You see guys convert in the minor leagues, and if you just say you spent 2 hours a day receiving balls from a pitching machine 100 miles per hour at the bottom of the zone, working on your receiving. With all this StatCast, like we know what a good catcher is and what a bad catcher is and what framing is. If you just spent so much time with your blocking technique, caught every bullpen you could possibly want to catch, constantly work on your throwdowns. It's like catching, there's less high-speed, really difficult movements. I'm not saying it's easy because it's not, but I would have if I went back in time 1,000 times, I would never had a good enough swing, or never been fast enough, or never had the hands to like play professional baseball as a shortstop or as a center fielder or any of that. Like I just physically couldn't do it, and I might never have been able to like pitch in the big leagues if I could go back and like do things differently. But as a catcher, I feel like if you put in the time and you're extremely focused and have just a incredible dedication to your craft, you can make it happen. I feel like it's very controllable in that sense because the skills that you have to learn, while they're difficult, they're very easy to repeat in your home. They don't require tons of equipment. They just require a lot of resolve, and you got to catch a lot of bullpens, and you got to be, like you said, be willing to wear balls off your body. But, I mean, a catcher can be as good as he wants to be, as far as I can tell. I don't know if you'd agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit it on the head that it's the skills, while not easy, it might be the easiest position on the field to log time doing.
Yeah.
So,
nothing stopping you from blocking 100 balls your dad rolls to you in your living room.
Right. Whereas if I'm a center fielder, how often do I have the opportunity to see a baseball off a bat? Like, it's like, it's hard. How often is a shortstop even? Like, how many I can get ground balls in the summertime, but it's like, it's a tougher thing to get
and you
done.
Can track, like, I could track fly balls. I was out the center fielder, and I thought I was decent tracking fly ball. I just would never have been fast enough. You know, like, if you're not a 6'5" runner, you can't play big league center field. Doesn't matter how good you can track a fly ball. You cannot play at that level. I mean, pretty much. So
I think there are a couple mental, like, barriers to jump over, but once you're over those, then it's like, just how many practice hours can you log, really? Yeah,
and if your throwing mechanics are also pretty controllable. It's a very simple throwing motion. Now there are definitely points where if you don't have a good arm at 15, 16, your mechanics are a little tougher to change. I'm not saying they can't change, but obviously a throwing arm is important. The better a thrower you are, that obviously pays dividends. I think the big league sliding scale is most throwdown speeds are between like 80 and 89. There's a couple 90s once in a while, which is pretty hard considering how fast they move. Kind of, they don't get as much of their body into a throw like an outfielder, obviously, or like a normal crow hop. But 80 to 89 or 90 is the sliding scale, with the average being like 84 to 86. I think that's I think the Statcast data on how fast a throwdown is to second base. And so I don't know. It's a very underrated position for sure.
And the only other thing I'll throw in there is, we talk about that, and obviously the component we haven't talked about is you have to be able to hit as well. But the one thing I will say is, at youth levels, and really even still into high school and into pro ball, college and pro ball, you can get away with 100 points less batting average if you're just a really, really good catcher. And really good catchers will earn their way into lineups and be forgiven their ability to not hit as well, just because. And that's been another big Statcast thing, is they found out years ago that a good defensive catcher will save way more runs than he could ever possibly produce at the plate. So it's like, they talked about the whole comeback of the catcher who hits 220, because they know that I don't need him to hit 35 bombs and have 80 RBIs. I need him to save me X amount of runs behind the plate just because he's so good.
Yeah, and in the book Big Data Baseball by Travis Salchuk, he chronicles the Pirates and how they turned around their organization in a couple seasons under Clint Hurdle, and Russell Martin, the catcher, was integral to that. And they talked about how, I think the guy's last name was Fox, but Mr. Fox was one of their analysts who was the first to develop framing statistics. And so he was calculating how much good framing versus average framing versus bad framing would save in runs. And when he first came up with his formula and ran the numbers, the number was so high, it saved so many runs and wins per season, that he thought the numbers had to be wrong. But it turned out that they weren't. It was just extremely underrated. And he's like, oh my God, no one else knows this. No one else is doing this. We have a huge advantage. Then after that got out, now everyone knows it. So, the playing field has leveled once again. But, I mean, saving a huge amount of runs, because with all the advanced sabermetrics, we know it's just about added value and runs and added, wins to your team. And the difference between hitting 220 and 260, which, seems pretty high,
substantial,
is maybe way smaller than the difference between being an average framing catcher and an exceptional framing catcher. So it's not about we'll just say, hey, all right, we lose 2 runs. We lose 2 runs on this catcher because he hits 220 versus another guy we get for 260, but he saves us 7 runs because he's such a better framer than him. So obviously it's just simple math. Would you rather have 7, runs added or runs saved than 2 runs? And that's just an example. I don't think that's really the way the stats work, but it's like pretty cut and dry. They're trying to discern value from players in different positions. And I mean, you see at the youth level, and it's one of those things where, say your company, like American Airlines, like airlines have taken a lot of flack. They shuttle through millions of happy, like whatever, neutral customers. They fly on their plane. Everything goes smoothly, not a big deal. But you drag one person off the plane, and everyone knows about it, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like catching. Like you catch a lot of balls, but the couple that go to the backstop that cost your team a run, it's like that's what people remember, and that's a big deal. And to be a great catcher, there has to be an extremely high level of detail and very few. Like you can't. It's not like, oh, but I blocked 27 out of 30. Well, it's like, well, dude, the 3 that you didn't block cost us the game.
Right.
So, like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. Like, oh, you get a 90%. That's an A in school, but that's an F because we lost because you couldn't block that darn ball. So, you have to be exceptionally good. I mean, you watch. I think people forget when they watch Major League Baseball just how good they are. And it's not even Major League Baseball, collegiate baseball. There's not many balls going to the screen. Whereas I watch games and there's 20 balls go to the backstop, and it like hurts me inside watching it. I'm like, oh my God, another ball, another ball, another ball. Mm-hmm. The catcher's constantly running back and the runners are constantly moving up, and it like hurts my soul. But that doesn't happen at higher levels of baseball. Oh, and the one thing I was going to mention, I wonder if you're a coach and you're watching this, feel free to like chime in and let us know. But I've seen more turf hops that are unblockable than like ever, and I never noticed it before, but I feel like it's awful. Like my catcher's getting down to block a ball properly, and then the ball hits him in the mask and just goes somewhere.
Yeah,
and it happens all the time because the ball, when it hits the turf, it's got backspin or forward spin, whatever, depending on the pitch, but it just kind of grips that rubber, compresses the rubber infield in that turf, and then it bounces. Just like that play we were talking about in our other video. Some of those long hops on turf, they don't skid, they just like catch and they bounce. And I wonder if that's a thing, because like almost like so many college fields are turf now. Like it's obviously it's got to be the majority are turf rather than dirt and grass. And like you never see that happen in the majors where it takes like a big hop. It always skids because it hits dirt or it hits the plate, and it just sort of bounces light. But I don't know. Is turf changing the way catchers have to? There's nothing they can do about it.
There's nothing you can do, and I would say that it's definitely worse, obviously, at youth levels, because you'll get balls that like bounce in front of the plate, and then it's just like forget about it. But where I noticed it most in my
that's true too.
Brief playing days, but even still, because one of your favorite things to do is when you have a lesson to throw curveballs back to them that bounce, and then it scoots on them, and then they don't know, they freak out. Well, when you get older and you're in high school and college and you're playing on turf fields and you have that guy that throws that curveball, that effect is amplified, and then you wear a lot of balls off your shoulders and off your face, blocking those curveballs on turf, just because some guys are throwing that curveball to bounce in the corner of the plate. So then then you're just toast. There's not like you said, there's not a lot you can do.
And maybe at higher velocities, maybe like in college, because that's what I'm wondering. I'm like, is this something that happens at all these colleges? Like their catchers are suddenly like missing a couple balls a game because they're taking, but maybe at the higher velocities. And like you said, less fastballs hitting the front of the plate. Maybe they do skid more just because more speed in a linear.
That might make sense because
I don't know.
From what I remember about blocking on turf is especially like fastballs, they hit me in the same spot, but they hurt more, which would be potentially what you're talking about there, where it's like they're skipping the same way, but they're not losing as much energy. So you're just like you're wearing a little harder on turf than you would.
Well, I would think they'd still lose. I don't know. I'm kind of like on the fence about turf if it takes energy or gives energy, because like balls that don't have a high hop, so like you hit that one that almost immediately rolls, they die on turf. And if you have a thin grass, they don't die, I don't think, quite as fast. But it also depends. Maybe
it depends on the turf and
the infield, because I know what field was I at? It was a long time ago, but they were talking about how they had more sand in the infield and around the catchers around the dish than they did elsewhere, because the more sand you have in the infield, the less bouncy it is.
Right.
So then it starts to play more normal, because you get to some of those turf fields and they're all rubber, and that was, I think, the standard for so long they didn't even think about it. But this past weekend we were playing on turf, and I hit them fly balls, and I made all my outfitters let the first two bounce just so they could predict what it was going to do, because you can't go out there the first time in a game and expect it to bounce off the grass and take a normal hop. It's going to legitimately bounce over your head if you run hard check up and then it hits a couple feet in front of you, it's not going to just bounce, to your crotch. It's going to bounce over your head and be a triple or a home run. So we did that stuff. But when you see rubber, it could be like a huge, like 9-foot bounce. But when you have a significant amount of sand in that turf, it just really deadens it. Which, and I wonder if there's an effect there. Maybe all colleges have sand in their infield. That it plays a lot more naturally, so maybe they do now. I don't know. It's been a long time since I was in college, but
yeah. An
there
eternity.
You go. Yeah, it's been an eternity.
And then if you
10 years now.
If you're not convinced to be a catcher, you can just watch that video of Yadier Molina wearing that ball off his nuts.
I didn't see that, but I heard about it.
Oh my gosh, it did not look pleasant. 104
104
miles an hour off the cup. No, thank you.
Wait, who threw it?
It was a foul tip. Or I don't know what it was. I think it was 104.
That's not ideal. Well, that's it. Catching.